There was no chance Joe Biden was going to win. Everybody knew. The Democratic Party tried to tell Americans that what they were seeing was simply not true. This was a behind-the-scenes act of corruption, if you ask me.
Which is worse, a cover-up or a lack of courage in party leadership? Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Jessica Yellin Show, where we meet weekly to talk about what's happening in the world in ways that are meant to inform, empower, and ideally keep you calm. Today, we are having an important conversation with former Congressman Dean Phillips. It's a conversation that some Democrats and some in this audience don't want to have, but I think is important to cover. It's about the Democratic Party, the press, and accountability, and what we need to learn going forward. Congressman Phillips briefly and reluctantly ran against President Biden in the last cycle. He did it to offer voters a choice, and he has been criticized and in some cases even vilified for speaking up. There is now a new book out that's getting a lot of press attention. It makes sense in my mind to take a moment to get into this right now and consider, why didn't Democratic Party leaders and the press speak out sooner and more loudly to ensure that Democrats had a competitive primary in a cycle when they were up against such a challenging opponent? So, Congressman Phillips, thank you, first of all, for being here and for sharing your time with us.
Oh, my pleasure, Jessica, and to everybody. Thanks for joining. Easy answer to your question, because there is no incentive to call it out. There is no reward for being courageous. There is no benefit, professional benefit, to getting out of line. It doesn't matter if it's a Democratic or Republican member of Congress, senator, elected official. You are vilified. Your path to leadership or professional growth is impugned, essentially, if you don't walk the company line. And we all know there's no such thing as a political purist. And I saw firsthand so many of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, with Trump, by the way, the disease is the same. It's not unique to one side or the other. There's no reward for being courageous, for saying what you feel. You're only punished. So all these conversations happen quietly. And rest assured, all of you watching right now, my colleagues were aware. Read the book, Original Sin. You'll see the names. You'll see the timelines. Everybody knew. So this notion that I was a savant or I somehow had unique access, just the opposite. I saw with my own eyes what Americans were seeing, and therein lies the disconnect now, I would argue, between the American electorate and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party tried to tell Americans of all political stripes that what they were seeing was simply not true, and we were wrong. And nothing is more dangerous in democracy, I think, than intentionally covering up, misleading, or dishonesty. And that is the why, because nobody would have been rewarded. And look at me. I was one of the very few, Jessica, I think, in Congress who never intended to be there in the first place, who never saw it as a multi-decade career. I saw it as service. And I don't want to make this too long-winded, but I will tell everybody, too, that in March of 23, I went to Vietnam for the first time to visit the site where my father, a U.S. soldier, was killed in 1969. And I remember sitting at the crash site where he and 7 other soldiers had been killed in a helicopter crash in a town called Pleiku, Vietnam, and thinking about, a million, just like my father, had literally given their lives in serving to serve their country. And I resolved on that trip home, again, March 23, that if ever faced with a dilemma, a political dilemma, that I would never place my self-preservation over the principle. And little did I know that within literally a couple months, I'd be facing that very scenario. So that's why I did it. I didn't do it to hurt Joe Biden. I did it because I ran for Congress in the first place to stop Donald Trump. And when I saw my colleagues literally enabling the sleepwalk into disaster, I simply felt compelled to call it out. And I simply wish more had done so. If they had, we wouldn't be talking about this right now, and nobody would be upset, because I think we would, at least watching right now, because we would have had a very different outcome.
And I want to have a forward-looking conversation. You brought up so much there. I want to pause for one moment first on what you talked about, a career of service, and want to acknowledge Joe Biden.
Absolutely.
And this is not a dunk on Joe Biden session. My own view is, whatever one's perspective on his policies,
Mhm.
this is a man who dedicated his life to public service. He arguably is a modern master of the Senate. What he was able to
Mhm.
get done in a very divided Congress in one term was quite impressive. And he will be judged for his political life for more than the end. And it's worth acknowledging that now also as he faces a prostate cancer diagnosis. I wonder if you'd like to comment on anything
I
about Joe.
would. In fact, Jessica, he was such a gentleman from the first time I met him. I gave a fundraiser for Joe Biden many years ago, right after Osama bin Laden had been killed. It was like a week after. He came to my home in Minnesota. I'd never been engaged in politics before. The way that he spent time with my kids, answered their questions, listened to what was on their minds was both remarkable and charming, and I think very meaningful. The way he treated me and my family during my career in Congress, the way that he called me the day that I left the Democratic primary, I think on March 6th of 2024, the empathy, the thoughtfulness. He called both of my daughters after that. On Air Force One once, he did a video for a sick friend of my daughter's who was also a friend of his granddaughters. This is a man of extraordinary decency and integrity and empathy. And I'm not impugning him, by the way. In fact, I'm convinced, having seen what I saw, sensed what I sensed, and now read Original Sin, which I think the reporting is very solid. I think Joe Biden was subject to this, not leading it. And therein lies, I think, the only criticism I would have of President Biden was that he had lost that ability to be a strong leader, not a decision maker, not a man of empathy, not someone who is senile, but the ability to lead. I think he was being led. And therein lies, I think, the crux of this problem. And those are the people that I think really have a lot of questions to answer from all of us.
It's it's what the person often who is struggling with failing health later in life is the one person who doesn't know they're struggling with failing
Exactly.
health. You need the people around you to reflect that. Let's
Yes.
get into the book for just a moment, and then I want to talk about some larger issues. The book does allege a cover up, and what I find kind of confounding about that is the majority of Americans were saying that Biden's too old to run. You claim that after seeing him a few times, you knew he was in too failing health to run. Um, I'm not so sure that is cover up the right word. Didn't Democratic Party leaders and the press at large, or some members of the press, know this? And do you think this was more a case of elite denial and an unwillingness to lose access to someone in power? And just quickly, which is worse, a cover up or a lack of courage in party leadership?
So cover up, infers that there was a plot and that there was a plan and a strategy. I don't believe it was a conspiracy of sorts. I do believe it was a group of people whose loyalty to a person overtook their loyalty to the principle of protecting our country. And that will happen time and time again. It's happened through human history. It's a natural human condition to try to protect the person to whom you're loyal, but not at the expense of a country. And that's what is so deeply troubling. My colleagues, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and Jamie Harrison, Democratic leaders, governors, senators, any aspirant to the White House, knew that they would not be well served by doing what I think most Americans were already talking about anyway, what they were seeing, which was this is really troublesome. Not that he had failed in his first term, he was wonderful, but that another 4 years, A, he probably couldn't make it, and B, most importantly, he wasn't going to win.
So this was a race where Democrats said the stakes were existential, that the opponent was someone who was an actual threat to democracy. And I think we're seeing that to, to varying degrees play out right now. So let's go back to those times. Have said that when you first got concerned about his ability to win, you went to Democratic Party leaders and urged them to get someone to run and challenge him. Can you take us into those conversations? Who did you press to run?
Vice President Harris, who was in the room, who's known Joe Biden for years, who attacked him vigorously in 2020, who met with him weekly, a woman of color, she wouldn't run. I called Gretchen Whitmer directly. Her very thoughtful political director said, please do not mention this, do not mention her name. And as a result, we can't have you talk. I called JB Pritzker directly, same thing. His team was rude and I thought reprehensible. I tried to encourage everybody, Newsom, Klobuchar, anybody. Of course, I knew they wouldn't do it though, Jessica, because they wouldn't give up. They wouldn't risk their personal futures for the country's. And when I say I tried, I went on the airwaves, I went on the Sunday shows, I made direct phone calls, I tweeted, I encouraged. And by the way, I didn't try to do this with a single individual. It wasn't about endorsing someone. It was, let's have a primary. And if Joe Biden wants to run, by all means, it's America. But the DNC should not be stacking the deck, precluding competition, threatening the consultants who are integral to a national campaign. By the way, we had people working on my campaign, Jessica, who had to use pseudonyms because if they were to affiliate with me or any challenger in that case, they would have been blackballed by the DNC. So cancel culture, in its core essence, this idea that if you feel differently, if you think differently, if you have the audacity to compete, that somehow your career will be ended. That is the fundamental issue that we're facing. And by the way, if you think it's any different than how my colleagues on the right have to deal with Trump, they know their careers are done. Their path to success is over if they even criticize the man. It's the same thing on the left. Most representatives are not as far left as a lot of the Democratic base, but they are scared, Jessica, to say anything, to do anything that might portray them as anything but a core ally to every single group that is seeking attention. And therefore, you have this paralysis of principle. And that is what is really detrimental to all of us and deeply disappointing, the lack of courage.
Would you say a little more about what you mean when you say the DNC threatened
Mhm.
consultants? Because,
Yeah.
yeah,
So you all know this is a massive industry. Billions of dollars spent every cycle. It's a archaic, fragmented, um, uh, ridiculously backwards, I would argue, industry that makes most of its money by a 10% commission on television advertising, which is why you see incessant television ads, even when there's no evidence that they actually work, even when digital media, clearly in this day and age, is far more effective, but they don't pay the commission. So we're human beings, we pursue incentives and we identify disincentives. So you have the Democratic National Committee that has a universe of consultants, they're called, media buyers, ad makers, the people that send all the garbage to your mailboxes, your digital strategists, and most importantly, your fundraisers. And by the way, there are only a couple firms in the country that are really good national fundraising teams. None of them, all of whom I talk with, all of them in line with what I was seeing and knew what was probably going to happen, none of them would work with me because they said it had been made clear. If they affiliated, they would never get another job on another campaign again. Jeffrey Katzenberg, I think is more his wife in Los Angeles, telling people if they were to support me, go to any of my events, that would have social implications to them. So and by the way, are these threats to life? No. But people take their professional and social circles very seriously. And Jessica, it is pervasive. And that is repulsive. It's wrong. And the DNC, Jamie Harrison was just he was an employee of Joe Biden's. Joe Biden is the leader of the Democratic National Committee. All they had to do is open the stage, have a primary debate, encourage others to just participate, and then let Democratic primary voters make the choice. That is the fundamental role, and they failed to do it because it was a concerted effort to pave the path for a single person, which is antithetical to democracy and certainly Democrats with a capital D.
it's such an important insight. And especially now, as Democrats face the reality that their approval is tanking and the party isn't finding a leader or a way to drive a message,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much to be said about the fact that these consultants are actually running the party.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Okay. Staff
but
and consultants. Mm-hmm.
staff and consultants.
Mm-hmm.
And they are also, by the way, intervening in the media space, which we could talk about another
We
time.
should talk about MSNBC and their role in all this, by the way.
What do you want to say about that?
Well, what I want to say is that I was one of the Democrats that for years just saw Fox News as a mechanism of the Republican Party, right? As the media division of the RNC, if you will. Little did I know that MSNBC is exactly the same, probably, frankly, even more directly tied. If you look at the talent and management at MSNBC, Obama alums, Biden alums, there's a revolving door. Members of Congress become consultants, become lobbyists, and former administration members go on to media. Look at Jen Psaki, you can just look down the list. And I'm not going to use names here, but I've had confirmation that the minute that I announced my campaign in the primary, which was not aggressive, I didn't receive a single invitation from MSNBC any longer, despite being the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, a regular guest on various MSNBC shows. Not a single invitation until the morning after the South Carolina primary, which was by design. That was Joe Biden's strong turf. And I was relentlessly attacked that next morning. That's how these mechanisms work. And by the way, I've said in the last week that the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is immeasurable. Joe Biden's a good man, Donald Trump's not. But Donald Trump does his corrupt acts transparently. We know what he's doing. This was a behind the scenes act of corruption, if you ask me. And that's what makes it, to me, even more egregious, because saying one thing, doing another is different than saying one thing and doing it. And therein lies the disconnect and the loss of trust and faith amongst independent voters, moderate Democrats, and certainly Republicans in the Democratic Party right now. The lack of fundamental transparency about how shit works. And I'll say this, Bernie Sanders, of whom I was no fan, I thought he was a crybaby in 2016, and I didn't want to hear any of it. And my goodness, did I experience exactly the same thing. I did a tweet to say, look, I'm sorry, I have to apologize to Bernie Sanders, whose message was spot on, whose disappointment in the DNC was shared. And that's a big part of this, Jessica. There has to be some degree of independence between the Democratic National Committee and the executive in chief.
And it sounds to me
It's the
like
same thing. I'm sorry, one more quick. It's the same thing for those in business. It's the same thing as having the chairman of the company also be its CEO. There should be a distinction so that you have governance and then you have executives. And therein lies, I think, something we should all be thinking about.
just to put a point on this to my audience, I think really what we're hearing is there's a lot of talk in the press right now about the cover up in the White House, whether, who did what, much less interesting and meaningful for the future
Yeah.
than what former Congressman Phillips is talking about right now, which is the party apparatus and how it surrounds and protects whatever is
Yeah.
decided as the sitting leader. And what is the need for transparency with the public? I want to push on another aspect of that, which is what's the press's duty.
Mm-hmm.
And let's spend one question on the book itself. During the campaign, Jake Tapper had you on in 2024 and quoted Democrats calling your run, quote, an exercise in narcissism. Personally, I know this strategy in the press. Instead of saying something nasty, you quote someone else saying it. That's a rather personal and pointed thing to say, a little mean. Do you think the media also tried to sideline, shame, and silence you? And if so, why? Beyond MSNBC.
So, by the way, and that was the least of what I was subject to. To have people who I admired, like Jim Clyburn and Stephen Horsford, infer that I was racist by campaigning in New Hampshire rather than in South Carolina, which was Joe Biden's protected turf, was not just offensive, it was just egregious and I think just disgusting. And the press, what I noted, Jessica, was that the press was simply buying into what was being distributed by this White House. These are very well-honed, impressive teams of people who are using all kinds of mechanisms and channels these days to send a message, to share veiled threats. By the way, think about it. If you are a prominent journalist and the Holy Grail is getting a sit-down interview with the President of the United States, do you think the White House press team is going to grant that interview to someone who's been digging and looking under the covers and questioning anything? Or are they going to reward the person who they believe will portray the president in the best light? I mean, this is not rocket science, folks. And then you have young journalists who have the incentive now to get clicks, not to disclose facts and to be celebrated for doing their jobs of investigating and being that, being so integral to democracy, they're rewarded if they do a headline that gets people to click on it. And what gets people to click on things is usually attacks or or miserable subjects, not important ones. And the White House was very clear to most of the press how this was going to work. And they would attack those who would platform me. They ensured MSNBC wouldn't. And as a result, you have people like Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson and everybody trying to get anybody to talk. And I was with Jake Tapper last night, and he was quite clear about the fact that none of the 200 people that are quoted or referenced in that book, other than I think me, not a one was willing to speak with him and Alex until after the election. So this was not an example of someone who discovered something as a journalist that he kept or she kept close to that vest so they could monetize it, which he's being attacked for. No, this was my colleagues and people in positions of power being unwilling to say anything until the moment they knew that it would be a benefit. And that's what I'm asking people to simply recognize. All of these arsonists now running to the fire, and I don't need to name names, but they are senators, they are governors, they are any aspirants, former cabinet members. You see them all on TV right now saying, we should have had a primary.
Right.
We should have done this. I can't believe what I'm reading. No, I'm not going to have that because it's absolutely a bold-faced lie. They waited until it was advantageous. And look, I'm not special. I just thought it was more important to be remembered for what I believed and knew in my heart was right, and I would lose my job for it, and I did, and that's just freaking fine. These people who now aspire to that job, I have to say, I cannot imagine voting for a single one of them because I know at their core they knew something that would have saved our country from this disaster, and they chose not to do it. That's how this works, and it is reprehensible.
It is even risky to say these things now with you when you're out of office. So I'm impressed that you're speaking. Let's talk beyond Biden for a moment. President Trump is 78 years old.
Mhm.
5 House Democrats have died in office in the last 10 months of old age.
Mhm.
Senator Chuck Grassley is 91 years old,
Mhm.
and at least 4 people who serve in the Senate are in their 80s. Dianne Feinstein died in office at 90 last year. Do we need formal reforms that allow or even maybe require that leaders step aside with dignity when they are too old or too ill to serve? And if so, do you have ideas about what those reforms would look like?
Yeah.
Fitness test, any? Yes.
Yeah, I do, and this has been a great disappointment as a Democrat. I believe deeply in meritocracy. I believe deeply in talent, not tenure, being the driver of elevation. Um, and I also believe in transition and rotation of ideas and people. My Republican colleagues do this much better. They have 6-year term limits for committee chairs. It's just a House Republican conference rule. As a result, you serve 3 terms as the chair of a committee or ranking member. It's time for somebody else. And you know what happens as a result? Once you've been at the top of the mountain, people tend to then retire from Congress. So you get new blood, you get new ideas. Democrats, why are Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, Steny Hoyer, Joe Biden? Why do we have this group of quite elderly folks still, at least in my first 2 terms in leadership positions? Because we only use tenure. And folks, if Democrats want to play and want to win, that's not how the country works. It's not how the world works. In fact, Democrats kind of fought so that merit and that access and even equity, we need generational diversity in Congress. And that
Well, how
has
do we do that? How do you do that?
very simple. We can't do. I tried. By the way,
Hmm.
I tried thoughtfully to encourage people to seek a new leader other than Nancy Pelosi. She's remarkable, but it was time. When Dianne Feinstein was so clearly incapacitated, I simply encouraged us to avoid what would have been a tragedy like we had with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? These are fine people in many cases, but what we have to do is stop using tenure as the driver for leadership and start changing the mechanism, if you will, to start rewarding talent. But and I have to, and we have to be forthright here. We have caucuses, of course, in the Democratic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Progressive Caucus. We've got a whole bunch, New Dems and the like. Now, the Black Caucus, really, I do understand. The way they accrued power over years was by sticking around. Things were not fair. There wasn't equity. And the way to ascend to positions of power was to simply be around long enough. And they want to maintain that, and I get it. But that action is working to the detriment of Democrats. And the party that is supposed to be appealing to youth and being the progressive party and innovative and bright and full of sunshine and energy, has, from my experience, become awfully stodgy. And Hakeem Jeffries and our new team, obviously younger, and I think that's going to change, but Democrats are doing it the wrong way. And there should be term limits on chairs. There should be term limits on leadership. And we can't continue to operate in the shadows like this. It's just not working. That's how we change it. It's actually quite simple. And I think term limits in Congress would be very healthy. Not 6 years like a lot of Republicans want, but I think 18 years between the House and Senate. And I'll say 18 years because
that's a reasonable term limit, 18 years.
But I'll tell you why. If you look at the entire U.S. Congress, you look Senate and House, most are well over that, although it's changing. But 18 years, it would be 9 terms in the House. It would be, of course, 3 terms in the Senate. Many members of the House go on to the Senate. And by the way, it takes time to be good at this. You've got to learn a lot.
Right.
But if you served a few terms in the U.S. House, 6 years, and then 2 terms in the Senate, and then your career's done, I think that's actually a good thing. There are a lot of relatively young senators who've already been there over 18 years, including my senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar. It's not supposed to be a permanent position, folks. And what happens? You deny future generations opportunities to participate. And if they can't participate, they go do something else. So you look at Bernie Sanders. I mean, it's enough.
I just want to explain to the audience, you also mentioned about tenure. He's referring to the fact that when you serve in the House, one of the ways you have influence is on a committee. And the longer you're there, the more senior you are in the committee. And this applies across organizations, not just the CBC. It's how the House works. And you're saying those important positions shouldn't only go to the longest serving members.
Yeah, it's actually more than that, Jessica. When you join Congress, you are assigned to committees, usually two or three, depends. And when you're a freshman, you sit at the very lowest seat. I mean, it's like a snake. There's like 3 or 4 tiers, and you sit at the very bottom. It's not a random assignment. It's not alphabetical. It's not draw your name out of a hat like we do for offices. It's all based on how long you've been there. And the longer you've been there, the closer you snake your way to the chairman's seat, right? And that means that someone who is simply able to, and by the way, who spends the longest time in Congress? People who come from districts that are not competitive, right? By definition. You come from a D plus 60 district in an urban area in America, you can sit in that seat for as long as you want. So what happens? 30 years it takes to kind of snake your way to the very top, and then it's your turn to lead the committee. Even if there's the perfect, great leader who understands the policy better, who can communicate better, he or she might be a generation younger and 20 years from ascending to the top. We don't even give them a chance. It's who's ever next. That is just, by the way, same problem in public education. We're rewarding teachers for simply being around a long time, and then young teachers who are exceptional see no path. They don't want to wait.
I think you should write a book on how to reform government. This is you've got some answers. You've seen the inside.
It's not rocket science, folks. It's the same way we live our daily lives, the same thoughts we have, what we believe to be appropriate and right. This is not rocket science.
I want to ask you, given what you've said about some of the people you reached out to run last cycle who declined, who do you see emerging as the Democratic candidate in 2028?
Yeah, I know a number of the potential candidates. Spent time with many. Some I think more highly of than others. The one who really intrigues me right now is Wes Moore. He was a little bit party to the. He could have been more bold. He was
Maryland governor.
Maryland Governor Wes Moore. And the reason I like him is because he has a military background. He's been a business executive. He's now the governor of a very important state, and he is a inspiring American. His story is inspiring, and he's unbelievably competent and a little bit of an outsider. Someone who wasn't party, if you will, to this nonsense. Someone who has not played this game for a long time, waiting his turn. And I'd like to get to know him better. I'd like to better understand, his principles. But I see him as someone who could, with some boldness, really be a great next generation leader. I will say, everybody who was on that stage in 2020, I don't need to name the names. You know them all. The ones that are now crossing the country on TV shows, and watch the people who will be the keynote speakers at every Democratic dinner in every state. They're the ones who will be on the stage next time. And they're the ones who chose not to do anything because they knew it would be better just to wait till 2028 for their personal careers than to say something when it really mattered. I can never support, endorse, or accept someone who I saw treat our Constitution and all of us so egregiously, dangerously. And that's when you ask about who might be next, that's someone who I think was at least enough on the outside that could deserve a shot. But Gavin Newsom, great, talented politician. But my goodness, nobody carried that fake, dangerous water more distance, more often, ignoring his own state at the time, than he. My senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar, one of the first people to go on the national shows after this debacle to say, gosh, we should have had a primary. Well, when I was saying the same thing, nowhere to be found, you see. So Pete Buttigieg sitting at that table, watching these ridiculously orchestrated cabinet meetings that is now, it's become fact. A great communicator, an impressive American, but my goodness, Pete, how are you going to demonstrate courage to the country in a new campaign when you couldn't demonstrate it when it really counted? So I'm sorry to be a little bit elevated in my disgust right now, folks, but these are just the truths. Hakeem Jeffries, someone who I believe in deeply, one of my favorite people in Congress. I struggle to understand how that can mend, how I can restore faith, how my faith can be restored in him, knowing, or Chuck Schumer or any of these people, Chris Murphy, who's now saying, gosh, I kind of wish I'd done more. He knew. So folks, when push comes to shove, politics may be different, but principles to me should be the determinant of human beings, especially in a democracy. And I'm just telling you, a lot of the people that we're talking about right now just lack principle. And I don't know how else better to say it. And you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe me, but most of Americans do.
They knew and didn't act. I just want to ask, did you reach out to Wes Moore real time last cycle?
No, I didn't, because first of all, and I'll be very clear. I reached out to Gretchen Whitmer and J.B. Pritzker because the polling, which by the way, if you go back to the polling at that moment and you see how there was no chance Joe Biden was going to win, but the polling indicated that a moderate, I hate the term moderate or centrist, but a thoughtful Midwestern governor, and it's from a state that Democrats would probably have to win. So, Michigan, obviously Illinois would probably be in the bag anyway. I think a Josh Shapiro should have been maybe, been in that mix at that time. But Gretchen Whitmer in particular, if you look at even how Donald Trump treats her, she's respected because she's tough, she's experienced, she doesn't back down, she gets stuff done. I really thought she would be the person. I thought it was important that we have a female president. I'm the father of two daughters. I think it's shameful. Mexico has a female Jewish president, for God's sakes, and this is the United States of America, and it's 2025. I was so upset that she wouldn't take the call because she'd already committed to being on Team Biden because they had roped her in. But I didn't call West because I think I'm not even sure he had been elected yet, Governor. I
Yep.
can't recall. He just
No,
wasn't.
there wasn't
He
time.
wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
Whitmer and Pritzker could have stood up a campaign immediately. Pritzker's wealth and experience and connection. Pritzker's wealth. Whitmer's national organization and team. They could have stood up a campaign quickly, and either of them would be president right now. Undoubtedly been president if they had done so.
My dad used to tell me that a leader is somebody who says what needs to be said before the public is ready to hear
Mm,
it at times.
mm,
People who do that often pay a high price. And I don't see a lot of that in our culture today. Our culture rewards people who go with the clicks too often.
Yeah.
Do you regret speaking out and would you do it again?
Oh, for those who joined maybe after I mentioned this, it was a trip to Vietnam to visit the crash site of my father, who died, was a soldier. He earned an ROTC scholarship in 1967 to go to college, couldn't afford it otherwise. Was sent to Vietnam, a captain in the US Army, was killed 5 days after the moon landing. And I went to the very site where he died, along with 7 other Americans, one of whom was a Mexican national who joined the US Army to go to Vietnam so he could become a US citizen, David Valdez. And I came home from that trip and just resolved that if I ever faced a dilemma of whether I should put principle over self preservation, that I would never, that I'd always do so, that I would never put my career, my personal interests above it, because I was sitting at my dad's crash site where 58,000 other Americans died as well, a million since our nation's founding. They put principle over self preservation, and I felt obligated. So when you ask would I do it again, absolutely. And by the way, yes, it came at a huge cost, personal cost, financial cost, relationships. But I got to tell you, I can't. The reward is perhaps the most extraordinary human reward I've ever felt in my entire life, which was to do the right thing at a cost and not to care what others think, to know in my heart it was the right thing to do. Man, that's powerful. And I tell all the people we just mentioned, Jessica, every one of them, the cost to them is going to be a whole lot higher because they are going to be forced to look at what they didn't do when they could have. And I will never be that guy. And I will always tell the truth, and I will always call out bullshit. I will call out corruption. And I'm not going to rest either, by the way. It's not about winning a race. I don't care about winning a race. What I care about is competition and opening doors to other talented potential public servants and breaking down these barriers to entry that two private corporations, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are private corporations, my friends. They have a monopoly on the most important industry in the United States of America. And every one of us on this visit is party to it. So the question is that in the best interest of the country, or is it better to maybe have some more competition, recruit more people, make it less toxic, broaden representation? That seems more compelling to me, and that's what this is really about. And I will make my new mission reforming the system and structures of the system to afford for that. It's not about winning the race or even being right, which is why I hope you haven't seen much from me in the last year saying, talking about vindication or told you so, because that's not what it's about, because we still freaking lost. And that's the only part of this, Jessica, that I would take back. I wish I could have done it better, somehow pulled the right lever, been louder, inspired somebody, or had succeeded myself. And I think if I'd had some more time and resources to introduce myself, it may have come out differently. But hey, I'm never going to regret what I did, because the cost of doing nothing would have been a whole lot higher, as it turned out to be.
Well, as you continue your work on developing reforms and solutions for government or sharing what you see needs change, I would love to have you back to have that conversation as well.
Thank you. I'm grateful, Jessica. And just to everybody, watching, no matter what you think of me or what I did or what occurred, whether you think it's time to move on and not litigate the past, I hear you. I would have thought the same thing about me, to be forthright. But I also ask that you open a little bit of space in your head and hearts to recognizing that people in whom you have believed and might continue to are also worthy of a little bit more investigation and consideration of who they really are and what they could have done and why we find ourselves in this position. So when they tell you that they know the path forward and they know how to win next time, think twice and help me just recruit great people who will get the job done and represent our values that do remain intact, but they're precious, and I'm grateful to you all. So thank you.
Thank you for your voice and your time today and just being a refreshingly real person. Wow.
Well, thank you. Hey, there's something joyful about being human
Right.
and being able to say what's on your mind and not be punished for it.
Yes,
So,
here on Substack, maybe not on
here,
main TV.
yeah. Love you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Be well.
Jessica. Bye,
Be
everybody.
well.